Hey guys, today we're diving into one of the most intense chapters in medieval history. What happened when Vlad the Impaler got his hands on Ottoman prisoners? Forget everything you think you know about this guy from vampire movies, because the real story is so much more complex and calculated than any Hollywood script could dream up. Hit that like button if you want the unfiltered truth. And tell me in the comments how far you think one man can go in the name of revenge and power. Now buckle up, because this story is going to completely change your perspective on what humans are capable of. Picture this. It's the mid-1500s in Wallachia, a small principality sandwiched between the Ottoman Empire and Hungary. You're standing on a battlefield where the air is thick with tension and fear. Ottoman soldiers, the most feared military force in the world at that time, are pleading for mercy. But the man standing before them isn't interested in mercy. His name is Vlad Dracula, soon to be known as Vlad the Impaler, and he's about to orchestrate something so psychologically devastating that it will echo through centuries of history. Now you might be wondering, what drives a man to become a living nightmare? Well, let me tell you, Vlad's story doesn't start with him as the villain. It starts with him as a victim. When he was just 11 years old, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were handed over to the Ottoman Sultan as collateral, basically human insurance to keep their father in line. Imagine being a kid, ripped from your home, and thrown into the court of your enemy. The Ottomans kept them for 6 years. 6 years of watching executions, learning about power through fear, and understanding that in this world, you're either the hammer or the nail. But here's where it gets interesting. While his brother Radu became close to the Sultan, even converting to Islam and earning favor, Vlad was the difficult one. He resisted, he fought back, and according to historical records, he was frequently punished. Some historians believe this is where Vlad's education in terror really began. The Ottomans were masters of psychological warfare and intimidation tactics. Young Vlad was taking notes. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia at 17, his father and older brother had been murdered. His homeland was in chaos, caught between Hungarian and Ottoman interests like a piece of meat between two hungry dogs. And Vlad? He was done being the victim. He was ready to become something far worse. Now let's talk about what Vlad walked into when he took the throne in 1456. Wallachia wasn't just politically unstable, it was a complete disaster. The boyars, the local nobility, were corrupt beyond measure. They'd betrayed his family, they'd sold out to whoever paid more, and they had zero loyalty to anything except their own wealth. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was breathing down his neck, demanding tribute, demanding submission, demanding everything. But Vlad had learned something crucial during his time as a hostage. Fear is the most effective currency in medieval politics. Not gold, not alliances, not even military might. Pure, unadulterated terror. His first move? He invited the boyars to an Easter feast. Sounds nice, right? Wrong. During the celebration, Vlad had the older boyars arrested and executed in the courtyard. The younger ones, he forced them to march 50 miles to the ruins of his castle and rebuild it stone by stone. Many died from exhaustion. This wasn't just revenge, it was a message. The old order was dead, and Vlad's rule would be written in iron. And here's what most people don't understand about Vlad's signature method of execution, because yes, we need to talk about why he earned his notorious nickname. This wasn't a quick process. Ottoman records describe how Vlad had developed techniques specifically designed to be as public and terrifying as possible. It was a spectacle, a warning, and Vlad's personal brand all rolled into one horrifying package. You're probably thinking, okay, this guy was clearly unstable. But hold on, because there's more to this story. Vlad actually brought unprecedented stability to Wallachia during his reign. Crime rates plummeted because, well, who's going to break the law when the punishment is so severe? Corruption virtually disappeared. Foreign merchants reported that you could leave valuables in the street and find them untouched days later. Vlad had created peace through absolute terror. So now we get to the part where the Ottoman Empire decides enough is enough. Sultan Mehmed II, the same guy who conquered Constantinople just a few years earlier, was not amused by Vlad's refusal to pay tribute. In 1462, The Sultan sent an envoy of about 1,000 men to Wallachia to, let's say, negotiate Vlad's compliance. This is where our story really begins. Vlad did what any reasonable ruler would do. He invited them to discuss terms. The Ottoman envoys arrived at his court, probably feeling pretty confident. After all, they represented the most powerful empire in the world. They had the military might of tens of thousands of soldiers behind them. What could this little Wallachian prince possibly do? Here's what he did. Vlad asked them why they didn't remove their turbans in his presence, as was customary when meeting a Christian ruler. The envoys explained that it was against their religious custom to remove their turbans. Vlad's response was swift and brutal. According to multiple historical sources, including Ottoman chronicles, he had them severely punished in a way that reinforced his point about respect and custom. The remaining envoys who survived this diplomatic disaster fled back to report to the Sultan. Mehmed was furious. He assembled a massive army, estimated at between 60,000 and 90,000 soldiers, to march into Wallachia and end Vlad once and for all. Vlad's army? Maybe 30,000 men at best, and that's being generous. Any sane military commander would have surrendered, negotiated, or fled. Vlad chose option 4, total warfare, with a side of psychological terrorism that would make modern strategists uncomfortable. Here's where Vlad's strategy gets absolutely diabolical. He knew he couldn't win a traditional battle against the Ottoman army. The numbers just weren't in his favor. So instead, he decided to make the invasion so psychologically devastating that the Ottomans would leave on their own. First, Vlad implemented a scorched earth policy. As the Ottoman army advanced into Wallachia, they found nothing. No food, no water sources that weren't poisoned, no villages that weren't burned to the ground. Vlad had evacuated or eliminated resources to deny the enemy any supplies. Imagine being an Ottoman soldier, marching through a land where everything is destroyed, where every well is contaminated, where there's nothing to sustain you except whatever you carried. But that was just setting the stage. Vlad's real weapon was night raids. He knew the Ottoman army's size made it slow and vulnerable to hit-and-run tactics. So he would strike at night, targeting supply lines, eliminating sentries, and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. The Ottomans never knew when or where he would attack. Sleep became impossible. Paranoia became the norm. Turkish chroniclers from the time describe how Vlad himself led many of these raids, sometimes disguised as an Ottoman soldier, speaking fluent Turkish from his childhood captivity. He would walk through enemy camps, gathering intelligence, and then vanish. The psychological impact was devastating. How do you fight an enemy who could be anyone, anywhere, at any time? One particularly daring raid became legendary. Vlad attacked the main Ottoman camp in the dead of night with the specific goal of reaching Sultan Mehmed himself. He came close, very close, before being driven back. The Sultan's own guards were neutralized near his tent. Imagine being Mehmed, the conqueror of Constantinople, nearly captured in his sleep by a prince from a backwater principality. But now we get to the moment that defines Vlad's entire legacy, the event that earned him his terrifying nickname. After weeks of guerrilla warfare, the Ottoman army was exhausted, demoralized, and running low on supplies. They were ready to push into the Wallachian capital, to end this war once and for all. What they found there would break them completely. As the Ottoman forces approached Targoviste, Vlad's capital, they encountered something unprecedented in military history. Picture this. You're a soldier who's already been through hell. You haven't had a decent meal in weeks. You've barely slept, and you're about to face what you hope is the final battle. Then you crest a hill and see it. A forest. But not a forest of trees. Stretched out before the Ottoman army, for nearly 2 miles, was what Turkish records call the Forest of the Impaled. Over 20,000 people were displayed as a warning. Ottoman prisoners of war, captured spies, traitors, and anyone Vlad considered an enemy. Some had been there for months, others were more recent. The sight and smell alone was enough to make seasoned soldiers turn away in horror. Now, let's pause here because I need you to really understand the scale of what we're talking about. 20,000 people. That's not a battle statistic. That's a deliberate demonstration of power displayed as psychological warfare. This wasn't done in the heat of battle or as a quick military action. Each person had to be captured. Each execution had to be carried out systematically. The logistics alone are staggering. Vlad didn't just defeat his enemies, he turned their defeat into a systematic message. Ottoman chroniclers describe how Sultan Mehmed himself, the man who had witnessed countless battles and sieges, was deeply disturbed by the sight. Even his most hardened generals were shaken. This wasn't warfare. This was something beyond war. Something that transcended normal human conflict into the realm of pure psychological dominance. So what was going through these Ottoman prisoners' minds in their final hours? Historical accounts and later testimonies give us some disturbing insights. Many prisoners, according to Turkish sources, literally begged for quick deaths long before their fate was carried out. Not after, before. Because they knew what was coming, and they knew that traditional military execution would be preferable compared to what Vlad had planned. The process was methodical and deliberately designed to create maximum psychological impact. Prisoners were kept in holding areas where they could hear what was happening to others. The mental torture began long before the physical end. You would witness others go through what you knew was coming for you. Some prisoners tried to provoke their guards into ending things quickly. Others attempted escape, though Vlad's men were trained to prevent this. Their fate was coming, but it was coming on Vlad's schedule, not theirs. But here's what really shows Vlad's calculated strategy. The arrangement wasn't random. He organized everything by rank and importance. The highest-ranking Ottoman officers were placed most prominently at the center of the display, lower-ranking soldiers surrounding them. It was a mockery of military hierarchy, a perverted organizational chart written in human suffering. And the prisoners who begged for mercy? Vlad sometimes granted different fates, but their bodies were still added to the forest. Because the display wasn't just about the act itself, it was about the message it sent. Turkish sources from this period are unusually detailed about this event, which tells you something about its impact on Ottoman consciousness. This wasn't just another battle or siege. This was something that traumatized an entire military culture that had seen plenty of warfare. Now, what happened next is where the story takes an even more dramatic turn. The Ottoman army, faced with the forest of the Impaled, did something unprecedented. They retreated. Not a tactical withdrawal, but a full retreat. Sultan Mehmed, who had conquered the Byzantine Empire, who had led armies across multiple continents, turned his massive force around and went home. Think about that for a second. An army of somewhere between 60 and 90,000 soldiers, supplied by the richest empire in the world, turned back because of what one man had orchestrated. Vlad had won without fighting a major pitched battle. He'd won through pure psychological warfare. The prisoners who begged for mercy had become his most effective weapon, even beyond their deaths. But here's where we need to address the question everyone's asking. Was Vlad insane? Was he a psychopath? Or was this actually a rational strategy? Modern historians are divided, but the evidence suggests something more complicated than simple madness. Vlad was brutal, yes, but he was brutally effective. His methods, as disturbing as they were, achieved their strategic objectives. He protected Wallachia's independence against overwhelming odds. He sent a message that would echo through history. This small principality was not to be trifled with. Turkish sources from the period reveal something interesting. After this campaign, Ottoman strategy toward Wallachia changed completely. They stopped trying to directly conquer it and instead focused on supporting puppet rulers who would be more compliant. Why? Because the cost of controlling Vlad's territory, both in lives and psychological damage to their troops, was simply too high. The forest of the Impaled had become more effective than any castle wall or professional army. Let's talk about the aftermath, because Vlad's story doesn't end with his greatest triumph. In fact, it ends in a way that's almost poetic in its irony. After defeating the Ottomans, Vlad's own allies turned on him. The Hungarian king, who should have been grateful for Vlad's defense against Ottoman expansion, instead imprisoned him. Why? There are several theories, but the most convincing is that Vlad had become too dangerous, too unpredictable, even for his supposed friends. Vlad spent 12 years in a Hungarian prison. 12 years after creating the forest of the Impaled, After literally forcing his enemies into submission through terror, he was reduced to a prisoner himself. The irony is almost too perfect. When he was finally released, he briefly regained the Wallachian throne, but his reign lasted only months before he was eliminated in battle. Some accounts say he was betrayed by his own men. Others claim he fell fighting against Ottoman invaders. The truth is lost to history, but the symbolism is clear. The man who lived by terror ultimately fell to it. But here's the thing about Vlad's legacy. Those Ottoman prisoners who begged for mercy, those 20,000 people in the forest of the Impaled, they didn't just perish for Vlad's political strategy. They became the foundation of a legend that would outlive everyone involved by centuries. The stories of Vlad's cruelty spread throughout Europe, growing more fantastical with each telling. By the time Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897, Vlad had transformed from a medieval prince into an immortal vampire, a creature that feeds on blood and cannot die. Think about that transformation. The real Vlad defeated 20,000 people and forced an empire to retreat. The fictional Vlad became an immortal monster who haunts our nightmares. Which one is more disturbing? I'd argue the real one, because the real Vlad was human. He was capable of calculated cruelty on a scale that most of us can't even comprehend. And he did it all while being perfectly sane and rational. Now let's address something that often gets glossed over in discussions about Vlad: the people who carried out his orders. Because Vlad didn't execute 20,000 people by himself. He had executioners, guards, soldiers, administrators who made this operation function. Who were these people? What kind of person can spend their days carrying out such orders? Historical records give us some clues. Vlad's executioners were often former criminals who were given a choice: serve in the execution squads or face execution themselves. It's a darkly efficient system. Turn your condemned into the instruments of condemnation. But even criminals have limits, and there are accounts of executioners who refused to continue, who broke down mentally, or who attempted to escape. Vlad's solution was predictable. They joined the fate they had helped administer. But some executioners became specialists, even taking pride in their work. Ottoman sources mention a few by name, describing them as efficient operators who understood Vlad's system perfectly. These men weren't forced into their roles anymore. They had become willing participants in Vlad's theater of intimidation. When we talk about the prisoners begging for mercy, we also need to talk about the men who heard those pleas and followed orders, hour after hour, day after day. This raises an uncomfortable question. If you were a common soldier in Vlad's army, would you have refused? Would you have stood up and said, "No, this is too far"? History suggests most people wouldn't. The banality of evil isn't just a phrase, it's a documented phenomenon. Normal people, under the right circumstances, can participate in atrocities. Vlad understood this better than most. He created a system where cruelty became routine, where following orders was just another job, like plowing a field or building a wall. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Vlad's reign of terror lasted only 6 years. 6 years. In that incredibly short time, he fundamentally altered the political landscape of Eastern Europe, created a legend that would endure for over 500 years, and became synonymous with extreme tactics. The prisoners who begged for mercy in those 6 years became the cornerstone of a reputation that would transcend history itself. But what's really interesting is how different cultures remember Vlad. In Romania, he's often portrayed as a national hero, a defender of Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion. Streets are named after him. Tourists visit his castle. He's on souvenirs. Meanwhile, in Turkey, and throughout much of the former Ottoman Empire, he's remembered as exactly what he was: a brutal ruler who committed mass atrocities. Both perspectives are technically correct, which is what makes this story so complicated. Vlad did defend Wallachia's independence. He did halt Ottoman expansion in that region, at least temporarily. But he did it through methods so extreme that they shocked even medieval sensibilities, and medieval people weren't exactly squeamish about warfare. The prisoners in the forest of the Impaled weren't just military casualties. They were pawns in a much larger game of power politics, psychological warfare, and historical legacy building. Their suffering served a purpose beyond their individual fates. It sent a message that echoed through centuries. Some prices are too high to pay, even for conquest. Modern military strategists still study Vlad's campaign, though obviously not as a model to emulate. It's studied as an extreme example of asymmetric warfare, of how a weaker force can use psychological tactics to defeat a stronger enemy. The ethical implications are debated in military academies and classrooms. Can terror ever be justified as a defensive strategy? Where's the line between necessary tactics and war crimes? Vlad's story forces us to confront these uncomfortable questions. Let's get real for a minute about what all this means. When we talk about prisoners begging for mercy and Vlad having other plans, we're not just talking about history. We're talking about the darkest capabilities of human nature. Vlad wasn't some supernatural monster or movie villain. He was a person shaped by trauma and circumstance, who made a series of choices that led to mass suffering. The thing that's most striking about this story isn't just the scale of what happened, it's how preventable it all was. If the Ottomans hadn't taken young Vlad hostage, if his family hadn't been eliminated, if the boyars hadn't betrayed him, would he have become the Impaler? We'll never know. But what we do know is that trauma creates trauma, violence begets violence, and sometimes victims become the worst perpetrators. Every one of those 20,000 people in the forest had a story. They had families, dreams, fears. They probably joined the Ottoman army for the same reasons most people join armies: economic necessity, social pressure, patriotism, adventure. They didn't sign up to become part of a psychological warfare display in a foreign land, begging for mercy that would never come. But that's what happened because one man decided that terror was the most effective tool in his political arsenal. And here's the really disturbing part. In the short term, he was right. His strategy worked. The Ottomans retreated, Wallachia remained independent during his reign, and Vlad achieved his immediate objectives. Does that justify the means? Absolutely not. But it does force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes in history, the most extreme tactics are also the most effective in the moment, even if they're morally indefensible. So we've reached the end of our journey into one of history's darkest chapters. The Ottoman prisoners who begged for mercy didn't get the compassion they pleaded for. Instead, they became unwilling participants in a display of power so extreme that it changed the course of history and created a legend that has survived 5 centuries. What can we learn from this nightmare? Maybe it's that the line between hero and villain is often determined by perspective and time. Maybe it's that extreme trauma can create extreme responses. Or maybe the lesson is simpler and darker. Humans are capable of unimaginable cruelty when they decide it serves their purposes. Vlad's forest of the Impaled is gone now, disappeared centuries ago, but its shadow remains. Every time someone mentions Dracula, every time Vlad's name comes up in history books, those prisoners are remembered not as individuals but as a statistic, a number, a footnote in someone else's story. 20,000 people reduced to a single historical anecdote about terror tactics. If you've made it this far, you've endured a pretty heavy story. Drop a comment telling me what you think. Was Vlad a defender of his homeland, who did what was necessary, or was he simply a mass murderer who history has rationalized? There's no easy answer, which is probably the most honest thing I can say about this entire difficult tale. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's most complex corners, hit that subscribe button, because we're going to keep exploring the stories that challenge our understanding of humanity. These aren't just tales from the past, they're mirrors showing us what humans are capable of under the right or wrong circumstances. The prisoners begged for mercy, Vlad had other plans, and history has never forgotten what those plans looked like. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.